There. Good to see you, by the way.
Yeah, good to see you as well. I should thank you for our last conversation and also for the comments and retweet you did of my last video. That was very kind. Thank you.
Oh well, I really I like the video. I like both the videos, but I really like the one where you were talking about comparing your position to my position. I found it was exemplary in how fair it was, and even-handed and insightful. And yeah, I wanted other people to see it. I thought it was good.
Cool, thanks. And that's also kind of what I had in mind for today,
Hmm.
because I found it especially useful to find what are the precise bridges between your position and my position.
Sure.
Um, and that's what we did regarding ontology in our last discussion.
Hmm.
And today I wanted to move on to sort of higher level topics, more
Sure.
closely related to the meaning crisis. But even still, I realized that there's a lot of ontology that has to be done there.
Always, you never get away from ontology. You never escape ontology. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, so yeah, especially in the last 2 weeks, since I knew we were going to talk, I spent a good chunk of time re-listening to some of your videos and thinking and writing about them to
Hmm.
sort of figure out what are the to get a grasp already of what would be the main differences, and also of your get a better view of your overall project.
Thank you.
And
Appreciate
I
that.
I can already say that it's been useful even in my spiritual life. It will become clearer in our discussion, but yeah, it turned out to be a very useful exercise, I think.
JP, it's interesting because a lot of people who I guess would regard themselves as religious believers often say that to me about my work, and so that for me means I'm talking in a way that at least I think it's fair to say this is at least capturing something important about their phenomenological experience.
Mhm. Yeah. And yeah, so for our discussion today, I tried to separate it in talking about the differences regarding some of the aspects you described, you used to describe the meaning crisis. So there's a set of historical factors we need to address, and there's
Yeah.
also perennial problems we need to address.
Yes.
And so for the historical problems, you treat them using cognitive science. And
Hmm.
for the perennial problems, you use the set of practices in Buddhism. And then
That's right.
you explain that the two, Buddhism and cognitive science are very closely, they fit together very well. So there's no clash in there.
Yeah.
Uh, and I see it that if I want to make Christianity a viable answer to the meaning crisis, then I still need I can still use that framework of there's on one side the historical factors and on the other side the perennial problems.
I very much agree with that. I think that's correct. Sorry, I just want to pause here for a sec because I think that that's an important point that needs to be a little bit more flagged, made a little bit more salient, for lack of a better word. I think that's right. I think, I, of course, I think everybody should try to come up with their very best, reflective response to the meaning crisis. But I do think having to deal with these two aspects is something that any good solution is going to have to address. It's going to have to address the historical analysis, and it's going to have to address the perennial problems. I agree, totally.
And because Christianity, and I think it will become clear as we discuss more, but really it comes down, I think, to the fact that there are more elements. I mean, there are supernatural elements which then you need to, which complexify things in terms of both aspects. Actually, for the
Sure.
historical problems, you need to explain how the supernatural elements are still available despite the historical factors. And
Yes.
also for the perennial problems, the practices, let's say for addressing the perspectival clash, for instance, you need to you need to avoid a perspectival clash with the supernatural as well. So
Yep.
so
Yep.
Christianity complexifies things in a way in terms of both aspects of the meaning crisis.
I think that's good, and I think that's. I'm sorry, I'm trying to compliment you.
Yep.
I'm not trying to sound patronizing. I think that is, an honest thing to say, a very intellectually honest thing to say. And one of the things I really like about you is you don't shy away. You really work hard at formulating problems clearly and not straw manning. So thank you for doing that. I really appreciate that.
Thanks. So yeah, as a first topic for our discussion today, I wanted to jump into the historical problems, and
Mm,
what I would like to do is, in the same way that in our last discussion we figured out what were the precise bridges between your version of physicalism and the version of panpsychism I'm most sympathetic with.
Sure.
It came down to a few bridges that were quite clear, I think, by the end of the discussion, and also the video I made later. And I think that's very useful to, it will become clearer as we talk, as I keep saying.
Please proceed. Please proceed.
So the first thing I would like to bridge the first bridge I need to cross is I think I've tried to put this down in terms of as simple bridges as I could. And
sure.
The first thing I believe I need in my ontology is to be able to talk about higher minds, not just human minds, but minds of, let's say, a church or science and so on. And there are two ways I think I can get there. The first one is using Bergsonian panpsychism, where there are ways to get there using Bergson. And also, I think, and this is where I would like to ask you some questions. In terms of, I know you talk about dynamical systems and about the fact that the human mind is a dynamical system coupled with its environment and so on. And I was wondering, in your opinion, what would it take, for instance, for let's say a church or a saint to have an actual mind?
So let's talk about that. I think that's a very good point, and again, great, very insightful. I don't know if you saw I did a Q&A yesterday, and I mentioned this a bit. I mentioned a really important, and it's on my channel if you're interested. I had a really good talk with Guy Senstock, and I had some similarly excellent talks with Jordan Hall. And so just give me a sec, because what was going on there was both with Jordan, it was Jordan Hall, it was a theoretical discussion, and with Guy, it was a practical, and I think, truly wonderful exemplification. What I want to talk about is the idea that I take very seriously, and I think it's part of third generation cog sci. And I think this might actually go to, let's talk about the Ecclesia first, a gathering, right? And I'm going to use that term broadly to mean neither secular nor religious. I'm just using it broadly, okay? And so the thing I'm pointing to that I take very seriously is distributed cognition. And this is part, and it's becoming a very serious part of, third generation 4E cog sci, the idea that just like computers are networked together to make the internet, which has emergent capacities that no computer has, individual embodied brains, always embodied brains, by the way, individual embodied brains can couple together and do distributed cognition. And most of our problem solving, in fact, is done in distributed cognition. You and I are talking, we didn't build this technology, we don't support this infrastructure, we're not making the electrical grid run, we're not doing any of that crap, right? So there's all of this distributed cognition is continually at work. And then the claim is that this distributed cognition has a collective kind of intelligence. I'm not attributing consciousness to it. You and I can talk about that, but I think it's clear to say that the system of distributed cognition, like the internet, can find, formulate, and solve problems that individuals can't solve. And then here's where it starts to move from just sort of a scientific description to something that has existential import. There are certain practices, and I've done this with. I did one with Peter Limburg. He invited me to one, and then we got into it. It was interesting how Guy sort of shaded it between, a discussion, and then he moved into kind of a circling, where what you can do is you can create a set of practices that are designed to enhance that coupling in distributed cognition and get into something that's, very much a collective flowed state, and also. That is tapping into not just propositional knowing, but the procedural, the perspectival, and the participatory. So it's got both deep vertical ontological access and then flowing horizontal coordination access. And then and what's interesting, first of all, I've done a couple circlings now. Every time it's been a very profound experience. That's the best adjective I have for it. What's interesting to me, and I'm trying not to be dismissive by using this anthropological language. I know you know me, so you know I'm not doing that, right? But what's interesting to me is in some of the literature and things like that is how often people will turn, and these are people that are clearly, by and large, post-religious, coming from a secular worldview, but they naturally fall into very sort of sacred and religious language to describe the experience they're having. So as they try to grapple with their confrontation of sort of the experience of the presence of this, collective intelligence and how it's making such a profound vertical impact on them, they're trying to coordinate those two things in their mind. They very readily fall into very religious language. They invoke sacredness. And they start to use some of the language that's similar to the more mystical aspects of the flow experience, what goes on in the higher states of consciousness. And so I think I'm trying to give you I know you want to reply to it, but I'm trying to show you, within a naturalistic framework, how I think it's possible to talk about something like the Ecclesia and a sort of super individual intelligence, problem-solving capacity that has a profound impact on the individual participants within it, that very often triggers sort of mythopoetic, symbolic kinds of language to try and articulate and express. And also, that language isn't just an after-the-fact expression. It's seen as facilitatory. And let me give you another example, just one. Sorry, I don't want. Sure. I just want to make this case very strong. Okay, and this is work I'm doing with Dan Chiappi. Okay, and what we're doing, and Dan's been a friend of mine since like in the early '90s. Just an amazing thinker and a great psychologist. He's at the University of California. And we're doing work on this following problem. We're doing work on, so you have people who are managing the rovers on Mars, right?
Yeah.
Right. And so you got this group of scientists and there's the delay. Because it's so far away, right? But what's really, really intriguing is the following thing happens, Jean-Paul. What happens is they start to take on the perspective of the rover. They'll say, like, I'm here near this ridge, or we, often the team, are here. So they'll fuse their identity with other people, and they'll fuse it into the robot, right? And the rover. And then they'll also internalize it backwards. They'll do stuff like when they're trying to figure out how to move the robot, they'll go like, well, here's my cameras, and they'll move their body around in order to try and get the perspectival participatory knowing. And what they start to do is identify very deeply with the robot. And they talk about how that identification process is actually really, really important to getting the group coordinated so that it functions through. Right. So, and some of the writers, they use this language on it, like the robot almost becomes like totemic for them. That's a term even one writer uses. And what's interesting is these hard-nosed scientists will talk like, they'll say things like this. They'll say, I was gardening in the morning and my right hand kept getting stuck in the garden. And then I went to the lab and the rover's right reel was stuck. And they said, what are you talking about? You're a hard-nosed scientist. What's going on here? So I'm not trying to attribute any non-causality or any magic, but what's important to me is, again, notice how this language is starting to become very, very close to religious. It's participatory. It's identification. You're integrating a collective identity into a focused symbolic identity, and that's actually needed for them to carry out the task. It's triggering the participatory and perspectival knowing in some very powerful ways. And so that, in my mind, is two, I think, really clear instances from very different domains where you see this phenomena at work. And so I'm very happy for that, for both of those. I think they're very convergent arguments to say that I can see something, at a higher level that is, like I said, they can solve problems that the individual can formulate and solve problems that not independent from, but not reducible to the individual human beings. And that is a truly participatory event for human beings that has a profound phenomenological and existential impact on them that often leads them very naturally into very symbolic and sacred language. So that's my answer to that. I think I can, go quite a distance towards getting something there.
Okay, yeah, that's very good. So it makes it clear what kind of bridge I need to cross to get to where I want to get, where those are actual consciousnesses, those higher minds are actual consciousnesses, and also, especially linking them to entities in Christianity. So let's say the mind of a church or the mind of a saint. Let's say if you take let's say if everyone is gathering in church to pray to a certain saint on a given day, there will be sort of physical instantiations of that saint. Maybe there are statues, maybe there's the priest acting as the saint, and then people are sort of bringing their own issues, their own ideas, and they're during the mass itself, there's sort of a set pattern and not that much variation, but maybe outside of church people are discussing about their issues and so on, and they're confessing and all that stuff. So so there's a very complex dynamic going on there, and the step I need to cross is to say that, well, then this saint is actually conscious. It's an entity that is not it's not completely independent from us, but it's still it's still a being by itself, and it's conscious. It has agency.
So let me make sure I'm getting this clear. This will only be a brief interruption, and I'm not trying to be reductive here. I'm trying to map on an analogical structure. So the way the scientists are focused on the robot, right, or the way the circlers are focused on what they call the we space, this collective thing that forms between them. You're saying the people in the church are focused on the saint. Is that what you're saying? It's serving that same sort of function?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah.
Okay.
And there's a further step, I think, because I also want to explain altogether from Bergson.
Right.
And it helps in getting in touch with the properly supernatural elements that are there in Christianity and that we can't avoid. So, for instance, Bergson made the case about life, that life itself was conscious, and he didn't give that much, that many arguments. He mostly tried to give a good intuition of what this consciousness would be. And especially in Bergson panpsychism, as we discussed a month ago, I guess.
Wow, it's been a month.
It's a mark of the mental of consciousness is action, and especially action that is unpredictable if you were to look only at the lower levels. So when I act, when I make a free choice, when I'm really conscious, you couldn't predict what I will do, or at least statistically, what I do would be statistically very improbable looking at the lower levels of, let's say, my brain. So for Bergson argues that you can see the same sort of thing happening with life itself. The way life, actually, the examples that Bergson gives in Creative Evolution is one of his big books, is that he said that you could see sort of this action going on with life and the creation of vision. He compared it to the way I raise my arm, for instance, is a lot like the way evolution decided to create eyes, create visions in different organisms, where every time I raise my arm, it's sort of the same intention I have in my mind. But if you were to look at the particles in my arm, it would look very, very, very different each time. The particle is moving this way this time, and the other time it's there are lots of variation at small scale, but at the large scale, it's a simple one decision I make. And Bergson thought it was similar with life, where life makes a decision in its very complex mind, and it has repercussions at the lower levels, which look very complicated if you look at a human scale, let's say, but are much simpler in the case of the human mind. And there's also an issue of temporal span there, in the same way that when I make a decision, it's one decision. But if you were to look at the events at the scale of my cells, let's say, it would take forever. It's like many actions. It would sort of look much longer at that scale. So you get the idea that the higher minds that higher minds have a different temporal span in their consciousness. They become they can act longer and longer.
So there's people on object-oriented ontology. Morton is one, and I think Harman, but especially I think it's Morton. Is it? Timothy Morton. No, they talk about hyper objects. They talk about things that's like evolution, that are clearly part of our ontology. But as you say, they work at a different temporal spatial level, and they aren't localized in space and time the way material objects are. It's one of the reasons why I always go on and saying I'm a physicalist, not a materialist, right? Because evolution, right, isn't sort of, spatio-temporally bound in one location or stuff like that. All instances of it are, but it in and of itself, as a process, it isn't. And so, yeah, I take it that there are already people doing serious work within what's called speculative realism, which you might want to take a look at, who they want to talk about, no, we have to include these kinds of objects. They're not things in the sense of material objects, right? We have to include this in our ontology, and they operate in relation to time and space very differently than sort of visible material objects. So that again is something that I think, I take that, I'm in large scale agreement with that. I think that that's a fundamental thing, and figuring out how to incorporate that into our ontology, which is what they're trying to do with object-oriented ontology, I think is a very important thing. I'm very excited about all of that stuff.
Oh, cool.
You would like it too, JP, especially Harman's work, because he talks about how there's an inner aspect to things, a way in which they withdraw from us, and so you may want to, you would probably find that very, very comports very well with your position. May actually help bridge these 2 points together for you. Oh,
that's really cool. Yeah, I'll definitely look at this. Yeah, and there's one last thing I want to say about Higher Minds for Bergson. It's maybe it gets closer to the idea of miracles, but for Bergson, it's because we can act at our human scale, doing things that seem very, very improbable at lower scales. It can help explain some things in the universe or in the evolution of life. Let's say it can provide a good explanation for the fine-tuning problem in physics. Because you can say that, well, it's because life made the decision of setting the constants of physics this way, for instance, so that life would appear. And you can also say, well, the reason why DNA seems so hard to explain, well, it's because it looks like a miracle at our scale, but for life itself, for this mind, it's not such a miracle. And these are empirical observations which could eventually be explained in terms that are not that improbable, but at least it sort of gets the idea of how we could intuit higher minds, like science, or for Bergson, life itself being conscious.
I think so. I mean, so where I think I'd go some distance towards your position, in that many people, especially people who take seriously ideas about deep continuity, talk about that kind of that relationship between higher level and lower level improbability. And I would also add in that a lot of what's going on in the philosophy of biology talks about that life is not just a passive receiver of evolution, that organisms are actually shaping their environment, and by their own behavior, they're shaping through epigenetics, they're shaping their own biology, and it's much more dynamic and complex. So where we, of course, as always, where we seem to part ground is two things, I think, where we seem to be different. I want to be very careful here, because the people let's go back to the circling. Not everybody, but I've read quite a bit of literature now. A lot of these people talk about that presence of the we space as if it has something analogous to a consciousness of its own. And given the fact that we have some evidence that make it a reason. I don't know if it's probable yet, but it's at least a empirically possible thing, that you could have more than one consciousness in your brain. I'm thinking of the experience people have in lucid dreaming, where they encounter other dream figures that seem to have an independent consciousness and perspective on them. I can see why people talk that way. I need more. I would say to you at this point, and this is where perhaps the risk element comes in. I would need a lot more evidence for there being an emergent consciousness unto itself, not just something that we symbolically represent with consciousness, because people clearly are doing that. That's not in dispute. That's why I'm trying to be very careful. People are clearly talking that way, and that's clearly helping afford the experience. Whether or not that's the case is a separate empirical question, right? Whether or not we can in any way get any evidence that consciousness exists unto itself the way your consciousness exists unto itself. That's why we need some empirical evidence. Like, for example, when the lucid dreaming, the way they do it is the lucid dreamers, when they confront the non-egoic consciousness, they ask it to try and solve problems that they can't solve and things like that. Or to give a phenomenological perspective, like what's behind me right now, and stuff like that, to try and test whether the kinds of tests I would use with you.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's how I would, that's where I would sort of,
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to say draw a line in the sand, because that sounds like we're adversarial. I'm saying that's where I would need to go to make that that extra step. And then the other thing, and this is where I would need even more, because you see, this is where on one level where I do part grounds with Bergson. The notion of the elan vital in evolution tends, Bergson, I know there's different ways of interpreting him. So the standard way of interpreting him reads that as a teleological view of the evolutionary process, and I don't see that. I think I'm willing to agree that life shapes itself and shapes its environment and shapes itself from its environment, but the idea that it is doing that in any foresightful way, I think that's very hard to defend, especially because of the way, so many species dead end, go extinct. There's all kinds of mistakes and wrong turns that seem to be better explained by features of the environment than any act of deliberation on the part of evolution. So that's why, it's funny, you might think this, I'm a little bit more open to the collective, the empirical possibility of the extended consciousness, but trying to get sort of a teleology into that's harder for me to see. Because I see that going against too much of the evidence within the fossil record. However, one more time, let me remind you that short of the teleology, I am willing to say that life has this, right? That life has a deeply participatory role in its own evolution. Yes.
Yeah, I actually think that's closer to what Bergson would say. Actually, in his book on creative evolution, he spends a lot of time arguing against mechanistic explanations of life, but also against teleological explanations. He says it's much more like the sort of creative activity that we do, where, the way I raised my arm, for instance.
No, totally. And that's why I said, I know there's a lot of controversy. And I was being very careful, because there's definitely the parts where Bergson seems to be arguing, but he also seems to use language like deciding and things like that deciding is a teleological action, right? It clearly is, right? If you don't decide on purpose, you're not deciding, or else you're just using the term and metaphorically, you're not using it,
Yeah, I guess that's something I'll need to work more on. Let's say, because it seems to be like, evolution can make decisions. It has agency, but it's not omniscient. So it can make mistakes. It can make errors in the same way that when sometimes I make decisions, but they don't actually work out in practice. Yes, I guess Bergson would have to hold something similar to that.
Yeah.
But
there's one other, so you're listing things. Another thing, okay, this isn't the same concern for you, but it's an important concern for me, and I know you'll respect it. You see, it's very important for explanatory purposes for me that the process of evolution is not itself an intelligent process, because this gives me a non-secular way of explaining the origin and the functionality of intelligence. And so that's a very powerful, explanatory thing for me. I don't want to get into any kind of homuncular fallacy there.
Yeah. I don't know how much further I could say about this part, though. I would like to come back to something you said earlier.
Sure.
About attributing a consciousness and agency to
the collective,
the Ecclesia. And I guess that's a point where I would need to do more cognitive science to be able to compare what are the processes involved in our cognition, and try to see how that applies in the case of a church or a saint and so on.
Yeah, and this is a very active debate going on. You would be an intellectually respectable company. That's why I'm treating you with respect, because there are people who are seriously questioning. So I wouldn't say it's consensus, but many people are willing to argue that distributed cognition has a supra-individual intelligence to it, and for reasons that I articulated, I think that's a plausible position, and like I said, it's not consensus, but it's certainly a significant minority of people, and it's growing. So, and then around that, so a lot of people are willing to countenance what's called extended intelligence. Right, that's extended intelligence, the way we're coupled to the environment, and especially how we're coupled to other people, and we can participate in a comprehensive dynamical system with others and the environment, because you were including also the structure of the church, the physical structure, and the icons and stuff. All of this can contribute, right? And think about how like what Hutchins talks about, like the navigational, the crew in a ship on the bridge, and how the equipment and the people and ship are all sort of coordinating together to solve the problem of navigating the ship and moving it around. So many people, myself clearly included, are really serious, about this notion of extended intelligence. Now, because of that, many people, and they're taken seriously, are asking the question, and some people are asking yes, whether it makes sense to talk about a distributed consciousness. Now, many people, where I think it's getting close to becoming an empirical issue, is that many people have they make points about sort of bandwidth issues and timing issues. That like so let me give you an example. There's lots of communication going on in the brain, and not all of it is associated with consciousness. And what you can ask is, right, but at least in my sense of the term, I'm sorry, I don't mean to step on your ontological toes there. Okay,
go ahead.
Let me play within the cog-sci world for a sec. Okay, so I have a lot of, at least unconscious to me. Okay, that's fair, right? There's a lot of stuff going on in my brain, so there's lots of patterns of things working in a distributed fashion that don't. And then the idea is, what kind of patterns actually are needed in order to be, I would call generators, you might say associate. I don't know what it is, but the kinds of Bayesian patterns that actually support consciousness. And so there seem to be, and I'm starting to talk about, I'll talk about this in the next video series, number 32, the next episode. You seem to need this very sort of tight causal coupling, compression, very tight, very tight timing. And so now, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not offering a refutation. This is a lively, ongoing debate. That's clearly the case. Okay, I'm just saying why many people and myself. Now, here's where I would include myself. We're suspicious that the distributed intelligence doesn't have consciousness because it doesn't seem to have these patterns, right, that differentiate, patterns of activity amongst neurons that lead to consciousness, right, as opposed to patterns of activity amongst neurons that don't lead to consciousness. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, and there's another thing I could mention. I don't think you'll find it convincing at all, but I guess it's still worth mentioning.
Well, I find everything you say, and I don't mean this in a dismissive fashion. I find it interesting. I find it thought-provoking.
It's in the same way that to argue for the consciousness of life, you could use small miracles like the constants of physics, or the apparition of DNA with Bergson. You could also look at miracles which happen in church or through the intercession of saints, and justify that, at least in Bergson's ontology. But yeah, I just thought it was worth mentioning, but I don't know that you'll be convinced by miracles.
No, I'm not going to be convinced by miracles. However, again, I'm sensitive, and again, I'm not asking you to buy all of this, but I think that these systems, here I have to be really careful with my language, so I'm sort of bending this term out of its normal usage. But I think these systems are clearly capable of, restructuring in a way that's analogous to what happens in our cognition when we have something like an insight and there's a kind of creativity. I have no doubt of this. I saw it. I got to participate in it when I participated in the circling event. Why this has connections to your tradition that you might want to explore. Well, at least I'm in the process. I'm working on my follow-up, my next video series, and it's try to get at the. Well, I won't go into that great detail, but the point that's going on there is, I think, something that was going on in Socratic and Lincus and Platonic dialogue. The idea that together we can create a kind of thing that can give us profound insight that we can't get to as individuals. So that's also in the Neoplatonic and Platonic traditions, which of course have been interwoven with Christianity for an extremely long time. And so I'm willing to say you could talk, like I said, I've participated in it, and it makes sense sort of from third-person point of view, that there are times when these systems go through something like self-organizing criticality, and they can sort of significantly restructure, and you can get creativity and insight, and you can get something like a collective flow experience. I don't think that's a miracle, but I do think, there is the generation of meaningful novelty. Okay. That is perspicaciously relevant to solving problems at hand. yeah, again, I think that's clearly a very reasonable thing to say.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm very happy about this. I think we make clear the bridges between your work and how we can link up to higher minds, especially in Bergson's ontology and in Christianity in general.
Yeah.
So now I'd like to move on to the next bridge, which I'm
Yeah.
trying to make to the God of classical theism.
Right.
And yeah, so you can make some way together using the idea of higher minds. But I was also curious to see. I've heard you talk about laws and weak emanation, and I was wondering, how exactly laws fit in your ontology, and how close does it get to, let's say, I think it's the point Augustine made, but also by lots of scholastic thinkers, that those sort of laws exist in the mind of God.
Yeah. So that's and I think. And I don't think Augustine would object to this at all. That's originally a Neoplatonic idea,
okay.
Right? So that is developed clearly before it appears in Christianity. So I don't think there's any historical dispute about that. You can even see, even before Neoplatonism, you could make an argument that you're seeing it perhaps in some of the Middle Platonists, especially in Philo, and things like that. So yes, that's definitely an important idea. Yeah. So this is where, I mean. So this is something I'm currently deeply working on, and and I'm not satisfied with where my thinking is on it at this point. So what I'm saying here, I'm asking for indulgence on your part and the part of the viewers, because this is something that I suspect is going to go through several more iterative corrections before I start to become more comfortable talking about it at large. But I respect our relationship, and so I'm trying to get trying to see through an ontology that works this way. It tries to take seriously both things. So let's take the Neoplatonic idea. The Neoplatonic idea is ultimately born out of the idea that there's something more in the cause than in the effect. This is the basic ontological move behind emanation. Things emanate because they're sort of, and I think this is this is one way, not the only way, this is one way of understanding what's meant by supernatural. The cause has more in it than the effect, right? And that's the emanation, right? And that's an explicit, that's why I made the connection earlier to Neoplatonism. That's an explicit methodological principle in Neoplatonism. The cause has more in it, because the cause ultimately is a greater source of intelligibility, right, etc. It usually, I won't get into the reason. You can just get that idea that the cause is unifying and greater intelligibility. There's more in there, and you can think about like the Big Bang containing all of the universe in it, and in that sense, it's so pregnant with everything. You can sort of get a sense of what they're talking about. That's just used as an analogy because the Big Bang is temporal, and we're talking ontological, right? So that's the basic move in emanation. Whereas the basic move within naturalism and emergence, right, is that the effect has in it more than the cause. The component causes interact, and then they produce something that has new properties, new features that are not possessed within the cause. Do you see what I mean? And that's why, right? And the point that is coming out of this for me, and this is where I see my hands are waving a lot. I'm trying to argue for a position that I call non-theism, because it's trying to say there's something deeply right about both, and I sort of line theism with a more emanationist approach, and for lack of a better term, sort of an atheistic, or at least secular, as from this bottom up, right? And I think, and this is again, my self-critic is just spinning crazily in my head as I'm trying to talk about stuff. I think what I'm trying to argue for in non-theism is I'm trying to argue for an ontology that acknowledges both of these as inadequate, that they have complementary sets of strengths and weaknesses. Each one can explain something that the other can't explain. Where each one comes into mystery, the other has a ready sort of set of intuitive explanations, and vice versa. And so I'm trying to think about, that there's some important way in which, and sort of Whitehead is helping me a bit here, in which possibility is really structured, and that's the source of emanation, right? And but that there's genuine emergence, and that's the source of real emergence, and I'm trying to get the idea that this goes back to John Scottus Erigena, who I'm reading right now, because he has this idea of creation as being the complete interpenetration of completely simultaneous, ontologically simultaneous interpenetration of emanation and emergence. And so I'm trying to unpack that ontology very carefully and trying to figure out what that would look like. And this is why I call this non-theism, because it seems to break both patterns, right? It seems to break the fundamental grammar of emergence and the fundamental grammar of emanation. Now, like I said, this is all very sort of, this is something that's very pro tem in my mind, very preliminary. I'm trying to get at it because I'm trying to, I want to ultimately ground out that intelligibility for us seems to be, right, we know it is. It's top down from normativity, like when I'm paying attention or thinking, and it's bottom up from perception and interaction, right? And I want to try and say, is that pattern that's so deeply interwoven into our intelligibility give us some deep insight into realness? That's the idea. Sorry, that was long, and I don't know if it was terribly clear, but I was trying to give you where my thinking is right now.
Okay, yeah, that was actually pretty clear. It was very helpful. I don't know how much further I can go towards this, though, because my thinking on this is also not that clear.
Yeah.
It's so difficult when you reach this
level. When you reach that level, it's like, human beings weren't meant to live in this realm.
Because when you're starting to talk about the idea that you get emanation and also emergence, I was sort of going to go into the same direction, because in Christianity, and it's something that differentiates it from Neoplatonism, you don't although things get their existence from God, you don't want to say that things somehow decay to matter. You want to say that there's goodness all the way through. There's and at the same time that God is giving the the forms, the structures to the world. At the same time that there's something emanating from him, he's also supporting all of the matter, all the potentiality. Everything exists. So you sort of need to get both sides coming together. But
and that's explicitly Whitehead's model, right? When in his bipolar, it's explicitly the bipolar notion that God is sort of the ultimate sufferer, not in the sense of distress, but the undergoer of emergence, and also the ultimate sort of emanator of of a structure of possibility that is nomological in nature. And so I like the fact that he was very clear that he thought he was breaking out of classical theism when he was doing that. And so, and all the process theologians have been wrestling with this for, I guess, over a century now, or close to it, about trying to say, can we reconcile this with classical theism? Because there's also, and here's where it gets so interesting, there's clearly people who come out of different traditions like Buddhism who are also deeply attracted to Whitehead's thinking. And this is, again, whether or not this ontology should be properly placed within theism, or it's something uniquely new. I take that to be a very open question right now.
I think that's really a bridge. It's not clear that Whitehead, if you take Whitehead's position and try to work out all the kinks, you get to classical theism, because in process theology, let's say God doesn't have omnipotence. He's a process that is constrained by by his body, basically by his sub processes.
He's self-constraining in a way that makes omnipotence and omniscience impossible for him. And that's kind of Whitehead's argument, that if something is going to be self-organizing, ergo a process, right? Ergo process. It can't be fully omnipotent or omniscient. Now, it doesn't mean that God is limited in other senses. God is kind of God is inexhaustible. You can't sort of spend God. He can't be dissipated in his activity such that he ceases to exist or anything like that.
And Yeah, so yeah, it's cool because at the same time, by talking about Whitehead, we got to the point where the iron minds that Bergson is talking about, because they have similar systems, and I think this is more than anything else, it's providing a way to bridge the perspectival clash that we get from our modern ontology and and scholasticism, basically. Because the first time even though I was basically a Bergsonian Christian, when I first got to my church, people started talking to me about Aquinas, and my church is named after Saint Thomas Aquinas, and there are lots of philosophers there, and they were all trying to convert me to Thomism.
Wow, what a great church to go to! I never went to a church like that. Oh my gosh!
And initially, when I read the first book that was handed out to me about Thomism, I didn't find convincing at all, because it's such a different way of thinking. If you take scholastic arguments, that argues from very simple principles, like the fact that things move, that things change, and you argue from the fact that things move right now to the fact that there has to be a first mover behind that. I'm not going to go through the whole argument, and that from especially I did my undergrad in mathematics and computer science, and from this mind where I did thousands of proofs in mathematics, and especially in the first couple hundred proofs you make, you're certain of your reasoning, you're certain it's correct, but the next morning you look at it and you found out you made an error, and so you get a bad opinion of your own reasoning abilities.
No, I think that's not I think that's a good way to get genuine and needful humility.
But that's exactly the feeling I had when I first was looking at scholastic arguments, because I thought, like, this is something I'm not qualified to think about, in the same way that when I first started doing mathematics, and it took me a long time to work through the arguments in more detail and eventually be convinced and find them livable. But I don't think this would have been even possible if I hadn't taken Bergsonian theism seriously.
No, I can see how that would be a necessary bridge for you.
And you can sort of see that the God of process theology, if you push it sort of to infinity, you get to a classical theism, in a way that as you get from lower minds to higher minds, as we talked about earlier, their action gets bigger, their temporal span gets larger, they get closer and closer to eternity. They have more and more. They're I don't know how much I can use those terms, but they get further and further removed from potentiality, and they're more and more purely actual creatures.
Sure.
And if you push that to infinity, where you have a creature that is just actual, that is completely outside of time, then you get the God of classical theism. So you sort of can get a hierarchy where it's at least intelligible. If it's more intelligible, the sort of creature you end up using scholastic arguments. If you go through that.
I can see that. I mean, there's various steps along the way where, of course, I would make objections, but I don't want to get bogged down in the details about that. One of the things I would say that's more higher level then, rather than, can you have pure actuality without any potentiality? Does that make any sense? And stuff like that. I mean, all the classical problems with a purely Thomistic interpretation of Aristotle, because Aristotle clearly has a pre-existing, there's an independently pre-existing potentiality, right? Matter, right? Again, let's put that aside, because that's going to be like, right? So I want to talk the way you did. You talked more existentially and personally. See, I have 26 years of lived experience with a Taoist practice that is profound on me, and the Tao Te Ching is a sacred text to me. Not in that I think it is a supernatural authority, in that as I grow, I constantly go back to it, and it grows in its ability to transform and challenge me. And I see Taoism, for example, as being extremely well suited to a process view that has this bipolar nature, right? And the thing about it is, and if that's fair, if you could say, that actually fits really well with this ontology, and it's connected to this deep, long-standing lived practices that, right, are very transformative to me. This is, again, and it's very, very clear. I think it's unquestionable that Taoism is a non-theistic position. You see, and this is where I keep coming back to, that when we get to this level of the ontology, I'm not denying that you can describe it the way you're describing it, and I'm not denying that that description plays a central role in your existential pathway. I'm acknowledging all of that. I'm just asking you to acknowledge that the same thing is possible also. And I think equally, it's hard to come up with some higher courtroom we could go to say, but here's the reason why the Christian thing is, not as good as the Taoist thing. And again, the Taoist thing is non-theistic. And so I'm deeply impressed by an argument by John Hicks, who's actually a theist, right? You'd really like John Hicks, I think. But he actually argues that the best way of explaining these kinds of things that we keep getting to, not antinomies within an argument, but antinomies between people, where we get to these points where there doesn't seem to be any honest way of deciding, right? He argues that that seems to indicate to him that the universe is spiritually ambiguous. This is how he puts it. That the evidential base is perpetually ambiguous. And for me, and I know you'll jump off at this point. I'm just explaining for me, the thing that therefore is closer to, right, that ambiguity, right, then either theism or atheism is non-theism. And so that's where I sort of come down on this. I sort of make a meta move and say, look, what's the best way of describing why we keep getting to these antinomies between people? Well, maybe it's that the universe is actually ambiguous. Like it provides some evidence for atheism, it provides some evidence for theism, and that the stance that allows you to account for more of the evidence, therefore, would be a position like non-theism. So that's sort of the final meta move I make. Again, that's a weak move. I mean, it's not weak existentially, but it's ultimately a pragmatic move, right? It's not a move that I can justify from first principles. Because it's an a posteriori argument. It's an argument running off the arguments we keep having, right? But I don't think it's an argument that should be ignored either. So I don't want to inflate the argument, but I don't think you can just dismiss it in a deflationary fashion.
Actually, that's very good, I think, because once again, we reach a point where it's clear what the intuitions are that make me go the further step to supernaturalism. And that's really good. The discussion is advancing well. If you still have time, I could go to the narrative step.
I can do about another, let's say 15 minutes. How's that?
Okay, that's good. We'll be able to get to this and maybe talk about some of the advantages. Maybe if we can get through other stuff, it would be cool. But yeah, for sure, let's try to talk about narrative.
Go where you want to go with this, JP, because you've been leading us excellently through this. It's been great.
Cool, thanks. So now the last thing I think I need to retrieve is a narrative in history, especially a narrative where God acts with us and in which we can participate. And there are two ways to gather. I mean, you can use, basically, if you use the classical God, the God of classical theism, then it's sort of natural.
JP, before I forget.
Sure.
Sorry, I apologize for interrupting because you're in the middle of making an argument. But I feel that we lost another point that I'd like you to come back to, because I think it's also relevant, about how we're getting to a place that might address the perspectival clash that's also part of the meaning crisis. We didn't sort of fully flush that implication out. I'd like to come back to that if possible, please.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I was, something I can talk about right now. If
you want to finish the argument you're making about narrative, and then we can come back to that, that's fine too.
Yeah, I think I'll talk about narrative first because it shouldn't be that long and it will help in addressing the perspectival clash.
Excellent. Okay, great. But as long as we get back to it, because that's, I do want to try and bring it back around to how might this be relevant to the crisis.
Yeah, that was my plan afterwards. I didn't know if I could get there. But yeah, I think narrative should be quick, because if you're on board with the God of classical theism, then you can basically take the old traditional theist tradition and understand it this way. And one thing that really helps, it helps already with the perspectival clash, is if you understand that hierarchy of higher and higher minds, you can understand how these minds act in history and how they involve you. So because let's say if we take Bergson's example of like life acting through very, very long time spans and having plans for where this life is going, then we can understand how there's a beginning, a middle, and an end where things happen in history. Higher minds act in history, and if you push that to the limit, to the God of classical theism, where he's not just acting in history, but his action is the whole of history, where there's a creation, there's a middle, and there's an end. So you sort of get the that's the idea for getting to a narrative. And yeah, to get to the perspectival clash, so that went pretty quick. Because if you want to defend Christianity, I mean, maybe I can talk about your solution first. The way to address perspectival clash, you had sort of two ways, if I recall correctly. There was a scientia intuitiva and also a practice to get to prajna.
And they're analogous to each other. Scientia intuitiva is from Spinoza and clearly the Western scientific perspective, and then prajna is from the Buddhist. And I'm not trying to identify them. I'm trying to converge them together, pointing to something in which people have states that alleviate. I want to say one thing, because it wasn't available to me at that time. I also see what's happening when people are doing the circling. They're also getting this participatory thing where they feel identified at multiple perspectives in a simultaneous fashion. And that's clearly also giving them a sense of sort of profound connectedness that would alleviate a sense of absurdity. So I would now put a third thing in, sort of that. Go ahead.
Okay, very good. Because I think the first step, if you want to, resolve the perspectival clash issue in Christianity, is that you also need to, because you have further bridges to cross. You need to, let's say, because Spinoza was doing scientia intuitiva in basically a materialist worldview, but I need to get to the supernatural elements. I need to get to the God of classical theism, and I also need to cross that gap in history. I need to understand how I fit, in a narrative world. And so what happens is, if actually I can tell you something that, that's why I said that thinking about those things in the last couple of weeks was useful to me even spiritually. It's sort of an exercise I do when attending mass. And it's something I stole from Jonathan Peugeot a couple of years ago, but now I'm going to.
Jonathan wouldn't regard it as stealing. He would regard it as inspiration. He's very, very generous with his insights and his ideas. Very, very generous.
He recommended that when people first start attending church again, especially after watching his videos, is to try to see things symbolically.
Yes.
So try to understand what is the symbolism behind all of those things.
Very much.
Now I think, especially for someone like me who has a scientific background, it's useful to not just get to the symbolism of it, but also link it all the way down to the ontology, to panpsychism. So it's an exercise I try to do when I'm attending mass, as I said, to see how everything. Let's say when we're praying to something, to someone, when we're praying for someone, and so on, when we're when we're using incense, when we're chanting, and so on, when we're doing all of those things, I try to see how it fits in that whole hierarchy, how it fits, how it influences things all the way down to matter, and also how it fits in the in God at every moment, and also in history, to see how my life fits in that, how my life fits as a narrative within the big cosmic narrative, and how God is acting in my life, how he has acted before, and how I'm going. And I try to get that.
Yeah, I think that's a symbolic version of scientia intuitiva, and I think it's very similar to Neoplatonic practices of the synthemata and theurgia and stuff like that. So I think and there's also versions of this, similar things in Buddhism. Again, not to try and be dismissive of you. I'm trying to respond honestly. So I think that's quite good. In that sense, in both sense, that I think there's it points to a very real capacity within human beings that is beneficial. So I'm trying to get two senses of good in there. I think this symbolic scientia intuitiva is to use one of my terms, it's a kind of psychotechnology that really does put people into a state that alleviates absurdity, because I clearly argue that you can't respond to absurdity in an inferential fashion because it's not generated inferentially. And so I think this kind of symbolic response that brings about an alteration in your state of consciousness, I think it's very legitimate. And given what we've also already been talking about, the fact that that might be, let's say, amplified by participating in, distributed cognition, I could see that as, being deeply empowering. How's that? Is that a reasonable response?
Yeah, I think that's good, and it also gets to maybe the next point I would like to get to. It's what are the let's say the existential advantages or disadvantages of the move I'm trying to make. And
Sure,
I guess the biggest advantage existentially is that you recover a sense of narrative.
Yes.
And so you can fit within a history. But also probably the biggest downside is the risks. As we said a couple of times, we have several intuitions which differ, which make us go one way or another. But those could turn out to be wrong, and there's a risk there.
Yeah, and I talk to people like you because I acknowledge that fallibilism on my part too, and in fact I try to be clear where I'm the least confident in what I'm saying.
And also, there's another risk I think that really we must acknowledge.
You also have another advantage. I mean, and it lines up with what you just said about being able to recover the narrative order. I mean, you have access, especially as a Catholic, or Jonathan as an Eastern Orthodox, you have access to an existing sapiential tradition with ongoing institutions and traditions, right? You have monasteries and mystics that are venerated and carried along. So you have access, and that's existentially important too, right? To be able to belong to a viable and living tradition, a sapiential tradition. Definitely. There is clear. I mean, it's preliminary, but Jun Sung Kim, one of my grad students and colleagues, he's got good empirical evidence. It went into his MA thesis, and it's going into work he's publishing. That immersion in a path is really facilitates the cultivation of wisdom. Now, it does, but here's where you're not going to like what I'm going to say. The path, that particular path doesn't seem to matter. Like immersion in a Christian path or a Muslim or a Buddhist path seem to all be equally good. They all are better than the atheists and the secular people for sort of cultivating wisdom because of problems of autodidactism. And again, this is not for those of you who are starting to, oh no, it's like I'm not ignoring all the ways in which religion and religious traditions have been pernicious. We're talking about a particular empirical question that we're carefully examining. So I just want to say that your approach has the extra advantage of you don't have to construct a path. You don't have to try and build these institutions, and you don't have to try and do without a tradition until one forms. You have it all there, ready to go. Now, the danger for that, if you allow me one more thing to say, is, and I don't see this in you, and I'm not saying, but there's a danger in that becoming a nostalgic avoidance of science and the scientific worldview. You're clearly trying to respond very deeply and in an intellectually honest way to that scientific worldview, and you've had scientific training. So I'm not accusing you of this in any way, but you could see how people finding the fact that there's an established tradition or pathway there ready to go, that could lead to a very kind of pernicious nostalgia, which I am very critical of.
Oh, that's very good. Actually, the point about existing traditions is something I had in my notes, but I didn't think I would have the time to get through. So cool that you made it for me.
Good. That's a good dialogue when people are helping and learning from each other. That's how you can tell when a dialogue is genuinely pursuing the truth rather than victory.
Yeah, and there's a point I can make about the fact that empirically we see that people in different traditions, whether it's Christianity or Islam or Judaism, that they still get roughly the same benefits, and it's something that even can be explained within a religious framework. Even in Catholicism, we do say that there's a lot of truth in different traditions. We explicitly say that we're building upon Judaism. We just say that the fullness of the truth is in the Catholic Church, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that we'll be able to detect empirically the differences between different paths.
Right. So that's again where you and I might part. That's a doctrinal statement because if you admit there's no way of empirically distinguishing. That's whereas somebody coming from my point of view, ultimately a scientific point of view, I'm going to say, well, I don't know what to do about that because there's doctrinal statements in these other, Islam certainly thinks it's the fullness that Christianity doesn't have, right, and things like that. So
that's another point. Like as when I talked about miracles earlier, that I knew this wouldn't convince you, but I still thought it was worth saying.
I think I'm happy with you stating things you feel you have a responsibility to state. This is a cooperative thing we're doing.
Cool. And there's one other advantage I think I need to acknowledge is that I I also have more difficulty. I mean, I have more work to do to make sure I'm avoiding bullshit.
Yeah.
Especially since once you allow the supernatural in, it's very tempting to use it as an explanation for everything. Every time you have something you can't explain, it's very tempting to use that. And I think that's something the Catholic Church does well. I mean, at a high level, the criteria for something to match as a miracle are very high. It's hard to do, but I mean, you can see it in the laity. I can see it in people I know, which are willing to attribute miracles everywhere and supernatural all the time.
Me too. And I mean, one of the dangers you have, you can see it in certain aspects of the New Age movement, when you move people from an established tradition, a sapiential tradition, I guess Paul Vanderklay would say a creedal position, setting the criterion becomes very, very sloppy. So yeah, miracles everywhere and anywhere. And then that just becomes, I think you're right. That just is clear. I think it's a fair way and a very empirically justifiable way of describing it. That's just bullshitting all over the place. You're just bullshitting all over the place, and you're not actually solving any of these. You and I are trying to solve these problems. I think that's a fair thing to say. But I mean, you can use the discourse of miracles to just avoid confronting issues and threats and problems, and that is clearly a kind of bullshitting that ultimately I don't think doesn't help the individual, and I think it's deleterious to people around that individual insofar as they influence others.
Yeah, it makes us slowly lose our grasp on reality.
Exactly, and that's why and you see this coming to a fever pitch, right, in Kierkegaard's teleological suspension of the ethical and the whole discussion about the potential sacrifice of Isaac. How do you distinguish Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac from the insane person who takes a gun and thinks he's got to kill the school kids? It looks very, very similar, right? And while one is the teleological, the suspension of the ethical, and it's the miraculous, but it looks a lot like the guy who thinks he's got to kill the school kids, and I'm not identifying them. Right? Kierkegaard's a profound thinker, and to simply identify them is also overly simplistic. To say, oh, they're just not the same, that's also overly simplistic. Like you said, you got to really work hard on giving me some clear, principled, non-question begging, non-self-interested criteria for distinguishing them. It can't be, well, my Christianity tells me that, but that's just circular. It's got to be something that you can appeal to that would help people. Because I mean, let's face it, this is becoming a pertinent issue for us right now, because there's more and more of these individuals. I mean, so I think, thank you for saying that. Sorry, that was a very long and perhaps overly wrought way of saying, thank you for saying that, because I don't think enough people, that's really honest and important for you to say that, because I don't think enough people who espouse a position, with Christian or other, in which miracles play a central role, talk enough about how serious that problem is.
Yeah, that's very difficult, and something that Christian mystics will say, that the way you develop when you develop your sense of the supernatural, you learn to see God, how he's sustaining things, how he is, the beauty that you can find in all things, and so on. It's not like getting a clear vision or a clear voice that tells you to do something. It's not supposed to be that way, and it's just a hard sense to develop. And institutionally, how do you deal with that stuff? I think it's always going to be a challenge, especially I mean, you can start seeing it with Aquinas, when he made the clear distinction between natural and supernatural, and it started to split further and further. And in some, especially Protestants, you'll see that there's really a two-story universe, where there's sort of our material world, natural, that is sort of self-sustaining, and there's a second story somewhere that's another sort of material dimension, but where God is, and it's tempting to always see that supernatural dimension intervening, and it has gotten very hard. And historically, we can see how it got harder and harder to get a close relationship to the supernatural, and how bullshit can become more and more prevalent.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's clear historically that's the case, and thank you for acknowledging that. I got about one more minute, and then I got to go. But so both of these conversations have been really excellent and helpful to me. I hope helpful to you as well.
Yeah.
And so I'd be happy to do another one with you again in the future if there's another topic. Yeah, for sure. So if you want to make that happen, count me in.
Yeah, cool. But I'm very happy. We actually got through all of my notes, so excellent timing. And yeah, I want to thank you again. These two conversations have been very useful, and your work as well has been very useful to me. So yeah, sure. If you think of some cool conversation, you can send me an email, and when I think of something, I can also send you one.
One thing I'm going to do, because I'm going to take the 3 videos, the 2 that you have done, and the one sort of in between that you did, sort of comparing our positions, and I'll send them all to Jonathan, because I think, I mean, you've talked to Paul. I imagine you'll talk to Paul again. I think Jonathan would be very, very interested in talking to you as well.
We talk every month, actually.
Oh, does he record it?
I mean, it's we talk in a sort of seminar with his top level patrons. So sometimes puts out bits about it, but usually it doesn't publish the whole thing usually.
Well, you know what? I'm still going to do this because I think coming from me, and he probably hasn't seen you in this kind of kind of arena. So if I have your permission to do that, I assume, and I'll send that to him because I'd like him to see sort of this sequence. And you know, I think you invoked him in both of our dialogues together too, and I have tremendous respect for him. So I'm going to do that, and we'll see how that goes. And like I said, I hope you talk to Paul again at some point. Yeah, he should be watching these videos too, because he's really wrestling with Christian ontology right now. That's becoming really something central to him.
Oh, cool. Yeah. So thanks again, and we'll talk later, John.
Okay. It's let me know when you upload it and everything like that. And like previously, I'll promote it and disseminate it. Okay.
Cool.
Thank you. Thank you, JP. Great. Talk again.
Talk again.